Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. Journalists who may be contemplating the tattered state of their profession and perhaps their own grim career prospects might pick up a copy of the Complete Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and turn to the tale of the man with a twisted lip, in which London's greatest detective uncovers the truth about a missing reporter, Neville St. Clair. St. Clair, it turns out, was not a victim of foul play. He had last been assigned a story about life on the streets of London, and disguising himself as a disfigured beggar, he had discovered that he could make more money panhandling than as a journalist. Now, individual journalists are not yet following St. Clair's example, but the prospect of journalism throwing itself on the generosity of the public is not outlandish. Journalism produces a public good, and we may be forced to pay for it in new ways. Philanthropy and perhaps some kind of public support, indirect preferably, so it can't be subject to political manipulation, may be part of the answer. But before we get to that, let us be clear about why the current crisis in journalism should claim our concern. Newspapers have historically performed certain critical functions, and I want to underline three of them. Newspapers have been the chief engine of original reporting. They have put most of the journalistic boots on the ground in cities around the country. They have assembled a broad public, including many people who would not otherwise seek out news about politics and public affairs. And third, they have presented a primary means for holding government and business accountable, not just because of the size and breadth of their audience, but because of the standards that the press has institutionalized and its ability to withstand both governmental and business pressure. And newspapers have been able to perform these functions, to produce news as a public good, because of the strategic position that they have occupied between advertisers and their markets. For certain kinds of advertising, newspapers have for a long time been virtually irreplaceable. And as the industry consolidated during the 20th century, the surviving papers enjoyed an extraordinary degree of pricing power, enabling them to cross-subsidize the production of some kinds of journalism that were really never profitable on their own. The modern newspaper has been a great cross-subsidy machine that allowed the rest of society to take journalism for granted. Newspapers have now, however, been plunged into a financial crisis fundamentally because they're losing that position. To be sure, the recession and some ill-advised and even reckless decisions by management have played a role in the crisis. But two long-term structural changes suggest that their problems won't be over when the recession is. The first is a long-term slide in newspaper circulation, which began decades ago, but is now accelerated, and which shows itself most dramatically in the collapsing circulation and readership of newspapers among young adults. The second aspect is the flight of eyeballs to the internet, where the lion's share of revenue from advertising goes to paid search, that is to Google, and where newspapers are unable to reproduce the advantages that they have long enjoyed in print, because Craigslist and other sites provide platforms for advertising without bearing the cost of news production. By the way, these two long-term trends are not exclusive to the United States. The declining news readership among the young is evident from surveys in many of the major democracies. And the impact of the internet on advertising revenue, even if it hasn't yet hit, is also going to undercut newspaper finances everywhere. But American newspapers and American democracy are especially vulnerable to these trends. Unlike the Northern European countries, we don't have an established tradition of press subsidies, and our newspapers, unlike those of both the Europeans and the Japanese, have also been especially dependent on advertising revenue. And we've historically had a highly decentralized press with many strong regional papers to match a federal democracy where we devolve a lot of power to the state and local level. And it's precisely at that level where the greatest vulnerability in journalism seems to be now. Now, so far, as the financial crisis has played itself out, relatively few newspapers have closed, but many are a shadow of their former selves, having cut their newsroom by as much as half or more, abandoned international coverage, closed down Washington bureaus, pared State House bureaus to the bone, eliminated science reporters, music and book reviewers, and whole sections of their papers. Meanwhile, a whole new model of journalism is emerging online, and in some respects, particularly in the range of opinion it accommodates, the online environment has great advantages over the traditional world of print. It would be foolish to predict whether the internet will ultimately be able to sustain the volume of news reporting for the general public that newspapers have. But it would be even more foolish to ignore the evidence of what is happening today. The reality is that resources for journalism in the United States, especially at the metropolitan and regional level, are disappearing faster than the new media can create them. Niche audiences will clearly be served, even as the number of reporters for the general news media has declined. Many journalists have found jobs in high-priced publications and websites serving particular industries. The oil industry, I am certain, will get good information about developments in Washington. But whether the public at large will get equally good information about the political influence of the oil industry is more doubtful.